Good afternoon and welcome to all of you. My name is Anna Barber and I am the curator of exhibitions and public programs here at the Martha's Vineyard Museum. I want to first acknowledge and pay respect to the Wampanoag people on whose land the Marine Hospital, where I am right now, and now the museum, reside. I am thrilled to be joined by David Foster for this program in conjunction with the museum's exhibition Nature and Change. David has been a Harvard faculty member in biology, teaching global change, ecology, and conservation ecology since 1983, and served as the director of the Harvard Forest from 1990 to 2020. Congratulations on your retirement. He is the author of 6 books, including his most recent, A Meeting of Land and Sea, Nature and the Future of Martha's Vineyard, which is an incredible book, and that explores the island's history, ecology, and conservation. David joined many colleagues in 2010 in writing Wildlands and Woodlands, a vision for the conservation future of New England, and he continues to lead that effort as the president of Highstead Foundation based in Redden, Connecticut. On the Vineyard, David serves on the board of the Martha's Vineyard Museum, which we are very happy to have him here, and the Edie Foundation, and is an advisor on the Martha's Vineyard Land Protection Fund and a research associate at the Polly Hill Arboretum. David lives in West Tisbury with his wife and their daughter. So we just want to say thank you and welcome. Thank you for joining us, David.
Thanks very much, Anna. It's great to be here. And I love the theme of stories from the Anthropocene. The museum is a very special place and its collections are fabulous. So what I'd like to do tonight is to dip a bit into those and other historical resources and talk about the Anthropocene, talk about the current conditions and future of the island, but do that in the context of history. So in order to do that, I will show some slides. So let me share some slides now. Okay. How's that? Okay, so the future of the vineyard and why does history matter? As I start, what I'd like to do is first pay my own respect to 2 of the most fabulous sources of historical information on the island. There are many people to acknowledge and many places to acknowledge where we get historical information, but the 2 that are most outstanding for me and for the work that I've been doing is the Martha's Vineyard Museum, which I'm going to talk a lot about tonight, and the Vineyard Gazette, which started in 1846 and has a complete record of all of its publications. And between the publication itself and the archives that are located at the Gazette, it is a fabulous complement to the resources at the museum. I'd point out that you can go on the website and find a lot of the resources that the museum has, and then you can go up to the library and archive and work with Bo and delve into the history. You can also contribute from your attics and basements and relative storage sites your own history, and there's a lot of history on the island that has not yet been shared, and so I'd encourage you to all do that if you're able to. Today, as I look to the future of the vineyard, I want to look back. I'm going to look back a long way, and then I'm going to focus very much on this subject that's in this particular Gazette. And that is, as you can see from what Henry Beadle Huff, the editor at the time, said, he believes that the publication of this study by the engineering or consulting firm Metcalf and Eddy was particularly timely and important. And he reprinted major portions of that report so it would be available to people who read the Gazette. So what I want to do tonight is to examine, in part, the issues that he felt and they felt were so important, and to examine them in the context of where we are today and where we're going into the future. And I'll provide more details on Metcalfe and Eddy, but let me just point to this little piece of the front page of the Gazette that's on the right, which is the challenge. And the following challenge is addressed to the citizens of Dukes County. And this was issued by Metcalfe and Eddy. And it says, can you be the exception and protect the rural environment of your county from the ravages of the despoilers? Or will you fall by the wayside with all of the others who have been attacked? You and Nantucket are the last bastions of hope for warm water islands lying off the eastern coastline of the United States. The next 2 years are critical. If by June 1973, the recommendations made in this report for this date are not implemented, in our opinion, Martha's Vineyard will have contracted environmental cancer, and by September 1973 will not only have been fully raped by the despoilers, but also will have contracted environmental terminal cancer. So Metcalfe and Eddy were looking at the environment of the vineyard, and they were concerned, and they posed some solutions. And we're going to look a little bit at that tonight. Okay, but first I wanted to just say a little bit about the sources that we use for our historical research. There are, of course, all of the paper resources, all the photographs, all the maps that one can find in the archives. There's also a tremendous amount of information out there in the landscape. On the left here, we show a student from Harvard in West Chop Woods who's coring this tree to find out how old it is, but also to find the record of growth over time. A tremendous amount of information can be gathered from that and from those rings on the history of the tree, the history of the environment, and the history of what people were doing with the land. In the center, we see a group of archaeologists from the University of Massachusetts and Harvard working on the top of Lucy Vincent Beach's hilltop at a time when it was much more intact than it is today. This is from the late 1990s, and they're excavating what was an incredible trove of information on the top of that hill. And to the right, you see a couple of people who work with me at Harvard who are out on Pipney Mouse Farm on Chappaquiddick, coring this small pond to look at the mud, obtain the mud, analyze it, and figure out the environmental history. Oops. You can also learn an awful lot just by looking at the landscape itself, both the condition of the ground and the shape of the trees. Here's a great picture of a tree in the middle of Quansu Woods, Quansu Farm, on property that's owned by Sheriff's Meadow Foundation. It's an open-grown tree that grew up in a meadow. It now is surrounded by what are going to be tall and straight trees that are growing up in a forest. And so walking through those woods, you can see the evolution of that forest and the evolution of that landscape. I want to just show this front cover of the book that I put together, not particularly to encourage you to go out and buy the book, although if you do, I have this little symbol up at the top, little logo from Martha's Vineyard Museum indicating that you can buy it there, in which case you'll be supporting the museum. But to indicate that a lot of what I talk about tonight, some of the stories, some of the figures, some of the maps are contained in the book. They're also located, all of them, on this website, which for convenience, I've put up an abbreviated link to this website, which is mv1850.com. And you'll understand the importance of 1850 as I go on. Let me first start in deep history, at least in terms of the island itself, and just recognize that the island has transformed over the last 20,000 years since it was shaped by the glaciers. It became isolated about 6,000 years ago, and it is shrinking, and it will continue to shrink. There's very little that's being added and a tremendous amount that's being taken. And so ultimately, the island which is already a constrained environment, is going to become even more constrained. And let me also recognize that for at least 10,000 years, there was an entire culture that utilized this part of what we call North America and lived on Martha's Vineyard. There were somewhere, the estimates range between 3,000 and 3,500 Native Americans who made use of the island. They were mobile, so they weren't just stuck on the island. They could get to the surrounding mainland and surrounding islands. The distribution of those people is shown, at least in terms of the most active use areas, is shown on this map in terms of these red sites. And as we can see from Beardstott's portrayal of Cuttyhunk and the small settlement that was established by Gosnold that fills this picture in the backdrop, our reconstruction, Beardstott's reconstruction, the descriptions of Gosnold and all, show that for those 10,000 years, the island remained largely forested. In other words, this group of people lived very successfully and what we would call very gently on the island and with the island, sustaining themselves almost entirely from native products and the use of the resources that grew on the island itself or in the surrounding waters. And from the distribution of the most active Native American sites, you can see that those areas were where you would expect them, where there's an intersection of land and water, where they could take advantage of estuaries, of shallow inland waters, great shellfish beds, coastal fishes, and then also use the uplands for a variety of plants and animals. All of that changed, of course, in a most remarkable way with European arrival. And from that point to the present, there's been a constant dynamic in forest cover. Now, this particular graph covers each of the New England states, so it tries to capture the New England region. But essentially, this history is what transpired on the vineyard. There was slow and then progressively more rapid deforestation and clearance. This forest land was converted into active agricultural land for pasture, for grazing, and for raising of crops. Until about the mid-19th century and then into the late 19th century, when there was a grand transformation and forests started coming back across the New England landscape and across the island, as we'll see. And the population, which is shown by this hashed line down below, continued to rise at a very rapid rate. So this period of time, 1850 and a little bit thereafter, is really a transformative period for the entire New England landscape. It's when the most extensive imprint of human activity was felt on the land. Not necessarily the most intensive in any given place, but the most expansive in terms of transforming the land. And the imprint from that comes right through to the present at almost any place that we go. What triggered that big transformation? Well, it was a shift in both the geography of the United States and the relationship of people to the land. These set of maps captured this perfectly. On the left, we see 1850 with the distribution of people. Now, this is, of course, focused on people who are part of the American census at that point. So it's ignoring all the native people who are in the West and people who aren't showing up in the census. But the bulk of people are shown in that landscape, concentrated in the East. And of course, the United States, the land that was owned and governed by the United States, only represented about a third of what we consider the United States today. If you look down below, you can see that the distribution of people and the distribution of agricultural land matches very well. In other words, these people were living directly off of the land and were subsisting by growing their own food and obtaining most of their resources essentially within their communities or within a relatively short distance, with some exceptions like on the coast where it was easy to travel great distances. And we contrast that to essentially the modern condition on the right side, where we can see that the bulk of people are scattered around in the Northeast, the Southeast, out in California and up in the Pacific Northwest. But the bulk of agriculturally producing land is in the center of the country. So in other words, we live distant from where we obtain our resources. There's no place where that's more true than on Martha's Vineyard, where the vast bulk of resources have always come for a long time from off island. But it means that we're not connecting the way that we live with the landscapes where we obtain our resources, where we obtain our food. And you'll see I'll come to argue at the end that there's a good reason that people are promoting local agriculture. There's a good reason people are promoting local forestry, because when you live off of your own backyard, you tend to take good care of it. And you tend to take good care of the people who help you produce those materials. So 1850 is a critical time. And on the Vineyard, we are just extraordinarily blessed with what is one of the best geographic depictions of that period for the Eastern United States. And so here's this fabulous map, which some of you may have heard me talk about. I've got a little logo up at the top left indicating that one can purchase this map at the Martha's Vineyard Museum shop. That's important. This is a map that we produced from materials that Henry Whiting produced. And having produced those maps, we donated them all to the museum and to the Poly Hill Arboretum so that they could easily distribute them and they could benefit from the fact that people appreciate both the cartography and, you know, kind of the artistry that went into this map, and they can support the organizations that are involved in it. So this map is extraordinary. If you look at it from this distance, you can see green, which represents forest area. You can see yellow, which represents pasture land and hayland. And you can see brown, which represents tilled fields. Extraordinary that somebody would take that care. But Henry Whiting was trying to produce maps that could be used from sea and could be used for people who were trying to reconnoiter based on what they could see on land. And so they ended up doing this for the entire coastal area, but the Vineyard is one of the few places where the entire land area was captured. I won't go into this in great detail, except to zoom in on the center of West Tisbury, called Tisbury here in the 1840s. And what we did was we took a much larger map that Whiting produced from surveys that went done in the 1840s. And we captured just the vineyard portion and some of the surrounding waters. We colorized it as Whiting did with some of his own maps, but not this particular one, so you could see the features. And here you can see the detail of the brown tilled agricultural fields, the pastures and hay fields in yellow. And then interestingly here, you can see in pink, the orchards. The detail, the precision, the ability to take this map and drop it on a modern map is really extraordinary. So in summary, the 1850 landscape looked like this. There was residual forest land that was very intensively used for a variety of products and to keep people warm. There was pasture land, which was all fenced. with either stone fences in the west, in the up island areas, or with wooden rail fences on the outwash and down island portions of the island. I have this quote down at the bottom to remind people that by 1850, people who were living off of the land felt that Martha's Vineyard was completely full. There was no more land, and there hadn't been from the late 18th century, because there was no more land to split up and share from one generation to the next. And so starting in the late 18th century, people who wanted to live off of the land moved off of the island. And that's when they started the migration from Martha's Vineyard to places like Maine and to elsewhere in the East Coast and elsewhere ultimately around the world. Of course, that peak in agriculture declined and reversed itself, and as fields were abandoned, they came back to forest. And so looking at the landscape today, we basically have kind of four major colors that are shown here. We have the original continuous forest areas, the areas that were never cleared. We call those ancient woodlands because they are permanently forest, not because the trees are necessarily ancient. There's secondary forest, which is forest that came back mostly spontaneously in the sense that there wasn't any human intervention other than to allow the trees to grow once they got established, although there was some planting of pine trees and a few other things. There's residual agricultural land, and then there is densely settled land, which is shown in pink. If you go to this website, one of the things that we provide is a web viewer. I've got the icon up there because this web viewer is also in the displays at the museum. So one can look at the 1850 map and then move this cursor in the middle back and forth and compare that landscape with today. There also is an app that you can download, so you can take this with you on your smartphone and you can actually see where you're standing in the landscape today and envision the way it was mapped in 1850. Now, this map is extraordinarily useful both to understand the landscape and understand the way it's changed. The most obvious is that Whiting did such a good job with the cartography and the surveying of the coast that his records have always been instrumental in figuring out the rate of erosion and change in the size of the island over time. And so here's a set of paired photos showing his maps from 1846 and 1886, where he's looking at how much change occurred over 40 years. And then from 1846 to the time of this particular photograph in 2014, showing 1,200 feet of erosion. Just a phenomenal rate of change. That allowed Clifford Kay to put together this fabulous map. He's got it depicted a little bit differently. We took all of his numbers and showed them just as bubbles, indicating the relative rate of erosion, showing how rapidly the south shore is eroding, and that there's generally an increase from the center of the island or the western part of the island to the eastern part of the island. So as we look forward to the future, there's a couple of big processes that people are concerned about. One is sea level rise and this erosion, and that is huge. And there's a major study that's coming out from the trustees of reservations, which was just highlighted a few days ago, that's going to focus specifically on the island and talk about some of the challenges and some of the solutions for dealing with that. One of the things that people have spent a little bit less time talking about is the impact of storms. And now storms, of course, figure strongly into the history of the island. And when people talk about sea level rise, they certainly need to consider major storms, both winter storms and summer hurricanes, because those will exacerbate both the rate of erosion and the rise of water through storm surges and so on to impact areas. But for the vineyard, as our forests have come back, we have also been growing a very potent form of destruction, which is the combination of wind and trees. Now, this happens to be a picture from southern New Hampshire looking at an old growth forest and showing that even the oldest and tallest and strongest trees can blow down easily in a storm. This happens to be the 1938 hurricane. But one could imagine the kinds of storms that might come to the vineyard by looking to the past. And so here's a map that we compiled of all the historic storms that had an impact on the vineyard. And they're ranked from this blue coloration, light blue, to dark kind of crimson or red, from weakest to strongest. And one of the really interesting things to notice is that the dates that are all circled in crimson are before the 20th century, and the ones that are memorable in people's minds who are living today, or in those stories that they heard from their grandparents or great-grandparents, are all circled in blue, indicating that they're weaker storms. So the strongest storms that the vineyard has experienced historically, which we should certainly expect to have revisit us, are ones that are of a distant memory. And the strongest of all of those is the one from 1635, just shortly after essentially the Pilgrims landed in Plymouth. So here on the bottom right is a reconstruction of the surge that was associated with that storm, showing that it was 5 feet in Boston, which was actually pretty well protected, about 15 feet in Providence, and 20 feet at the head of Buzzards Bay. Now, it won't be that big on the vineyard. Storm surges as they go up into a bay like Buzzards Bay get accentuated, but this would be a storm surge unlike any that has been experienced in anything like recent history. And this is a reconstruction of what that windstorm looked like in terms of the distribution of wind speed and kind of direction. So the bottom shows a compass from 45 degrees, so northeast to west, 270 degrees, and then the distribution of winds for some of the important historical storms. And so you can see the storms that we think of as recent memories, like Hurricane Bob from 1991, were 75-mile-an-hour sustained winds coming from east to about west. The 1635 hurricane had sustained winds of 100 miles an hour and had an immense breadth of wind direction, which means that not only was it a powerful storm, but it was a storm that would kind of wreak havoc from many directions. I guess when I think about transformation and the future of the island, I certainly worry about sea level rise. I certainly am concerned about hurricanes. But the thing that worries me the most and that has transformed the island the most is what we do it to ourselves. And so when it comes to taking action to shape the vineyard for the future, the responsibility really lies directly with us, not with figuring out how we're going to cope with something that nature is going to bring on us. And of course, this is a long story at the vineyard. This wonderful picture of the proposed Lagoon Heights map, just one of many great developments that was proposed and partially executed on the vineyard, along with this fabulous quote from O.G. Stanley from the late 19th century, where he's imagining progress spreading and a vast resort covering the entire island from Edgartown to Gayhead. Well, not all of that came to pass. Some of it did, much of it didn't. But by the 1970s, there was huge concern, and this is where the story of Metcalf and Eddy comes to play. When you talk about history of the vineyard, one of the fabulous books, which unfortunately many people don't know of and others may have forgotten, is this fabulous book written by Anne Simon, which is about the early days of land protection, of environmental awareness, and concern about development. It's not the earliest concern that people had, and she wasn't the most active person, but she did a fabulous job to both be involved and to capture it. And so this is a period that led to incredible action and proposals for action by Senator Kennedy and others to deal with what was viewed as an unbridled wave of development that was spreading up the East Coast. And in the early 1970s, when Anne produced this book, she included this map in it, which showed the proposed developments that she was aware of on the island at that point. And again, not all of these came to pass, although you can see some symbols in there of areas that certainly did get developed very densely at that time or shortly thereafter. But it was the combination of that fear of development and really the lack of regulation and the lack of local advancement of proactive conservation and guiding regulation that would help to control development, help to control environmental damage, and help to conserve big blocks of the island intact. And so, to their credit, island leaders in the towns decided to hire this consulting firm of Metcalf and Eddy to undertake this study to, as they put it, to prevent environmental cancer. And so this is a map of the conditions when they arrived to work on the island. There were 7,000 buildings. There was a modest amount of protected land, but there was very little regulation and very little planning. And so Metcalf and Eddy undertook this very comprehensive study, interviewed people and studied conditions, and produced really a marvelous and unfortunately largely neglected study today on the future of the island. And what they recommended was something that should be a bit familiar to people, which is they recommended a kind of three-pronged approach. One is to greatly beef up and strengthen local environmental oversight and zoning and building and so on through local boards. They also suggested that the island very proactively identify areas for growth. And they identified an area that went essentially from Vineyard Haven down towards Oak Bluffs and Edgartown. So the kind of north to southeast corridor of the island. And they wanted to concentrate development there and yet to also afford green space and to keep connectivity for trails and to a certain extent for natural flow and stream flow and all. They proposed a significant amount of land protection. For example, you see in the north, this town green belt, which is to separate out areas of densely developing landscape. They also suggested conserving the major streams in the western part of the island, Mill Brook and the Teasquam. And then they made what ended up being a very controversial proposal. They suggested that there should be major conservation of the South Coast, but that should be happening through federal intervention with perhaps a national park or a national wildlife refuge. Well, anyway, they suggested, as you can see, that there were 6,300 acres, that about 10,000 acres would be conserved by the federal government, and another 6,000 or 7,000 acres would be conserved through local and state intervention. And then they envisioned what would happen by the time the island built out. And here they look at the future, and you can see this concentrated development in the northern part of the island, and then going down towards Oak Bluffs, out onto Chappaquiddick and down into Edgartown. You can see the conservation lands that are providing access for recreation, for natural environmental processes, and for human enjoyment in general. And they envision a played out future in which there are 32,000 from 7,000 buildings, And there's a shift from 6,000 to 7,000 acres of open space to 22,000 acres. So not all of that came to pass, but major changes happened. There were major changes with local regulatory structure and local boards. The Martha's Vineyard Commission was established. The Martha's Vineyard Land Bank was established. The intervention of the federal government was rejected, but instead we got a state legislatively created Martha's Vineyard Land Bank and Martha's Vineyard Commission that could provide twofold oversight, planning, protection, and land conservation. That brings us up to the early 2000s when, again, island leaders and citizens decided that there was a time for another comprehensive plan. And instead of reaching outwards for private consultants, they've essentially decided to do it together, led by the Martha's Vineyard Commission and engaging hundreds of people in all the towns across the island through a really comprehensive and really admirable process. And the ultimate plan that was developed is fabulous. Unfortunately, it's largely been neglected. It hasn't been neglected in specific details, but in terms of its comprehensive nature, in terms of a guiding kind of Bible, it is nowhere near as well admired and well scrutinized and well adhered to as it might have been. But the island plan looked at the situation, and by 2010, things had changed quite a bit. There were 22,000 buildings. There were 20,000 acres, each increasing from about 6,000 or 7,000 from Metcalfe and Eddy's day. And you can see what the land conservation and the development pattern looked like at that point. Much more development, much more concentration. The southern tier of federal land never came to materialize, but some other really large conservation areas were established. The island plan decided that they would take an approach that was different then, but parallel to that taken by Metcalfe and Eddy. They decided, well, we should try to concentrate growth and we should try to increase the amount of land protection so that we can have more natural process, more recreational areas. We can use nature to help support all of the vineyard in a variety of different ways. And by nature, I mean both a combination of natural areas like forested areas and open grasslands that are conservation lands and active farmlands. And so this is a map just showing the kind of suitability for preservation, the kind of scoring from relatively low to very high and critical that was used that they suggested be used to guide conservation going forward. Well, the island plan ended up modeling what population would look like and building would look like. They didn't actually end up modeling conservation. So as part of producing the book that we published, Brian Hall and I decided to model that out. And this is the resulting map, which, like Metcalfe and Eddy, projects out to the future what the island will look like if this plan is followed. And so what you can see is that buildings have increased and they're concentrated again. The island plan looked at this corridor that goes from Vineyard Haven down to Edgartown and then up into Oak Bluffs as being the area of densest population development. And then there's an increase in land conservation. With it being assigned, we ended up assigning this according to the pattern that had been used previously and then weighted by the priorities that were declared in the island plan. So you end up with a kind of built out condition by the early 2030s of 31,000 buildings, 27 to 28,000 acres of conservation land. And so that brings us to the present. We're not in 2030 yet. We're not in the 2030s yet. We're in a situation where a lot is at stake. We've got natural processes that are going to affect us, like wind and sea level rise and surges. And we've got development and the transformation of our natural landscape. And so the question is, where do we go forward? We've got 40% of the island conserved, 30%, a remarkable number actually, developed, and 30% what people like to call up for grabs, meaning the decision is yet to be made. And there's about 23,000 buildings. Do we go towards Metcalfe and Eddy? Do we go towards the island plan? The numbers actually are not so different, though the patterns are, interestingly. Or do we go in another way? And I guess this just lets me stop and invite some questions and have some discussion. But I'd say that the work that I'm currently doing now, and I actually still am teaching at Harvard for another year or two while I teach a conservation course and kind of continually focus my activity at both residing on the vineyard and trying to advance across New England this kind of combined plan of wildlands and woodlands and the New England food vision. These seek to really envision and advance a future for New England in which the bulk of the New England landscape is conserved as forest land, as farmland, that we do plan and develop in very strategic ways. We look carefully at every time we convert a farm or we convert a bit of forest to something else, because that is directly supporting us as the way all of earth processes have supported people forever. And that we try to bring more of this food production and even more of this timber production and wood use and so on into our backyard, so that we have farmers who are neighbors that we're supporting. We know where our food is coming from. We can be sure how it is being produced. We can be sure that it is of the highest quality. And we can be responsible for the way that we live on Earth. So anyway, that's a bit of my kind of peculiar take on the history of the island, a little bit on its future, and I very much look forward to chatting further. So thanks very much.
Thank you so much, David. Again, if anyone has questions, please ask now. I'm wondering if, oh, actually we have a question that just came through. Here we go. So Bob, hi Bob. Bob Blacklow is asking, how much of the 30% up for grabs do you think is essential to be preserved before we tilt the balance of no return?
Well, I think one never tilts the balance of no return. We know that people can live in incredibly densely settled areas with all kinds of life support systems in terms of food and resources and all. People are incredible for their capacity to tolerate those kinds of conditions. I think I would flip it around and say, how much of that 30% really needs to be developed? I mean, I think we have lived on Earth with an extraordinary hubris that we can keep mining it for resources and it will continue to take care of us. But climate change is showing us that's not true. And so climate change is just one manifestation of the Earth no longer taking care of us because we're not taking care of it. So I think the vineyard is never going to be and never has been self-sufficient, but the vineyard can be much more careful in the way that it cultivates and stewards the place it calls home.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So Kim is asking a question that sort of follows that. Well, what do you see as the best way to help or enhance the up for grabs acreage, i.e. organizations to donate to?
Yeah, I think that's a great question in many ways. I mean, I think that there is so much that we can all do. by directly donating and by supporting the activities of the organizations that are conserving land, by supporting the organizations and entities that are trying to plan the future of the island. So by that, I mean the Martha's Vineyard Commission and each of the town boards. But there's something for us to do in our backyards, in the way we care for our own land, and in our behavior in terms of where we buy our food and where we buy our other resources. So, you know, we have the Martha's Vineyard Land Bank, which is, of course, actively conserving land. And I'm afraid that too many people assume that the land bank is kind of taking care of things. But we know very well that the land bank is conserving things based on the rate at which real estate sells. And some good portion of that real estate involves new development and the transformation of the landscape. And so organizations like Sheriff's Meadow Foundation, the Vineyard Conservation Society, this Martha's Vineyard Land Protection Fund that was mentioned earlier, are all groups and entities that are trying to work collaboratively in different scales with the land bank and others to conserve land.
Okay, so we definitely have some more questions here. So Susan is asking, with 23,000 buildings now and 30,000 in your 2030 projection, does that seem likely to you from today's perspective, or are you more optimistic?
You know, I am always optimistic. I mean, I wouldn't have been involved in 2005, we wrote this first wildlands and woodlands paper for the state of Massachusetts. And we said, at that point, Massachusetts had a little over 60% of its land in forest. And we looked around and we realized that there were lots of organizations that were conserving land. There were lots of state agencies that were conserving land. There were absolutely none that were setting goals. And so we took the opposite approach, but we're academics. We're not trying to make a living conserving land. We have the luxury of being able to say, well, what is actually possible? And so we looked at Massachusetts and we said, it's absolutely possible for Massachusetts to protect 50% of its land base in forest. And we've gone on from that and said, and we should conserve all of our existing farmland. That was laughed at when it first came out. It wasn't given any credence at all. But if you look at what the state of Massachusetts is now talking about, they are very actively talking about trying to conserve up to 50% of the forest area in the state, perhaps more, and very actively trying to conserve as much farmland as possible. So I think optimism, even kind of audacious challenge, is good to have, because you can change. These projections of the future are just that. They are just scenarios for debate and to galvanize action. So
Caroline has a question that's interesting. On 2 acres in Oak Bluffs, we spend significant resources to maintain about 1 acre of little bluestem grass, which keeps the cedars and pines from taking over. Are grasses as important as trees?
So that's the fabulous thing about the vineyard in the New England landscape, right? Is that it really was in 1500 largely forested. There were grassy areas, most of them were wet. Very few of them were in upland areas. We've created those upland areas through agriculture, and most of them are best maintained by grazing them or managing them very intensely, as it sounds like you are. They're important habitat. And so they can serve a very important function. And they're also part of our cultural landscape. And so for a variety of reasons, both for biodiversity, for aesthetics, for a sense of history, for support of agriculture today so that we can live effectively off of local resources, they can be very valuable. What we have been arguing is that since most of those areas were created by agricultural processes, that where it's possible, conservation entities that manage those areas should manage them in collaboration with either farm animals, like the Martha's Vineyard Land Bank, which has owned a flock or herd of goats, or through collaborations with farmers, so that you can get the benefit of both maintaining the habitat and the landscape, and also allowing local farmers to produce local food.
That's a fantastic idea. Tanya has a question here. Thank you, David. It is wonderful to have people like you on our beloved island. My question is, if you had a large bundle of money and unlimited powers, how would you spend it to preserve or improve the island as we know it today?
So the model that the Martha's Vineyard Land Protection Fund is trying to take, and it's a very small fund, but it's trying to just be, a group of people, and especially a few individuals who became concerned about all of these issues and decided that there should be more than just is being done by existing organizations. And the model that takes is to try to leverage its funding as much as possible. So if you had a lot of money, that what you really want to do is to find ways to work with as many landowners as possible and help them do what most landowners want to do, which is to conserve their land. And so you try to make the money go the farthest in a variety of ways. Some landowners can actually donate part of the value of their land, or in some cases, all of it. In other cases, there are neighborhood groups that would be very interested in contributing. And so a kind of seed amount of money could catalyze local donations to actually conserve more and more land. And that's, of course, a strategy that in many ways the land bank takes. The land bank tries to partner with other organizations. It tries to get the absolute best value it can on every piece of property. But there's even more that can be done, and it may be that some private organizations can find ways of doing that on a local scale all across the island.
So Louise is asking about water. Is there going to be a problem with fresh water on the vineyard?
So the vineyard is an extraordinarily well-watered place. So the vineyard, there's absolutely no reason the vineyard will ever run out of water, because it has this immense aquifer sitting underneath it. The challenge with the water on the vineyard is the same challenge with the water on the Cape and other glacial coastal landscape, in that there is one major, there are multiple, but there are some primary sources of water. And if they get contaminated, it's easy for that to spread. And so the big challenge for water on the island is contamination, either with nutrients that then ruin the great ponds and the estuaries and all, or, God forbid, with contaminations that are actually dangerous for people. So yes, I'm worried about water, because I'm worried about what expanded development can lead to what happens underground.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we have a question from Jim. Hi, Jim Richardson. Nice to have you here. On sea level rise predictions by mid-century, maybe 5 feet, end of century, 15 feet, inundating harbors. What is your take on how drastic this will be?
Yeah, it'll be very interesting to see what tack the trustees of reservations takes on this, but as part of this entire coastal Massachusetts survey and study that they're doing. They're spending a lot of time in each location, as they have on the island and they have on Nantucket, talking to local individuals, local officials, very knowledgeable people. I guess one of the concerns that I'm kind of an advisor on that study. One of the concerns that that group of advisors has is that there's too much complacency, and there's too little proactive work. And I don't mean proactive in terms of trying to prevent this. I mean proactive in terms of trying to accommodate it. And, this is human behavior. We ignore things until the water is lapping at our doorsteps. Or in the case of wasteway, until your front porch is practically hanging off the edge of the cliff. So I think, Jim, those predictions are really substantial. They represent substantial danger to the island, not as a whole, but in terms of critical parts of the island. And more needs to be done sooner and proactively. And the Vineyard in general has a very good, relative to other places, reputation for trying to accommodate nature rather than trying to combat it. And there have been major proposals to combat nature by putting up seawalls and barricades and of a variety of types that have been rejected. And I think that is certainly the approach. Nature supports us in many ways. We should support nature and allow it to support us, and not try to help nature in ways that may actually oftentimes make things worse.
So I think as we're nearing 5, we have time for just one more question. And there's one that was raised that I think brings us back to the beginning, that I'm curious also to hear your answer on. So Bob Blacklow is asking about how specifically the Martha's Vineyard Museum, but I'm curious how you see the role of museums in participating in the efforts for conservation, beyond just, maybe it is just as repositories for these really important pieces of the past to learn from and move forward. But what do you see the role of museums, and specifically our museum, in helping to be a part of this effort?
Yeah, I guess I personally would like to see every venue that can be more proactive in sharing these stories, both from the past and towards the future. And, I just think that the way that this island came together and produced the island plan and really worked in a kind of community-based and concentrated way to grapple with the past, grapple with the challenges of the present, and look to the future was really admirable, and that we should be doing more to highlight that. I think museums, especially historical museums, have an awful lot to share because they have this time perspective. And that time perspective can go across both the land and kind of the physical environment, as well as the cultural environment and social conditions. And the combination of the newspaper, the museum, and other places of great historical perspective are in good positions to share these stories in proactive ways.
Yeah, and we are blessed to have a newspaper that is 175 years old this year. To be able to have that archive is truly extraordinary. So we are at 5 o'clock. My apologies to those whose questions did not get answered, but I'm sure it is not the last time that we will see David. And I want to thank you again so much for the work that you've done, the work that you're doing and continue to do in the future, both in all of your efforts around the island and beyond, and also with us here at the museum. So thank you all for joining us, and thank you, David. Appreciate it.
Well, thanks very much. And people can certainly follow up with me. I'd be very happy to answer anything by email or otherwise.
Yes, wonderful.
Thanks
Thank you
again.
so much. Thank you all. Have a good night.